Hello, my name is Jordan Tobias, and today I'm going to be talking to you about William Rathbun's essay titled 17th Century Japanese Blue and White Porcelains. A little bit of background about Rathbun is that he was a curator of Japanese art at the Seattle Art Museum. In his career, Rathbun had published multiple different books and essays on a variety of Japanese art subjects, ranging from porcelain, like the essay I read for you today, to textiles and prints as well. Interestingly enough, I wasn't actually able to find that much information on Rathbun. I couldn't even find a photo of him. The gentleman in the bottom corner of this slide is actually the owner of the auction house that held Rathbun's estate sale after he passed in 2013. So, one of the things I found out about this is that Rathbun was an avid collector. I saw the listing of this estate sale, and they advertised that they had over 230 objects from his personal collection in this sale. So, Rathbun had a very large collection. In addition to what was a part of this auction, there was also multiple pieces that I found donated to the Seattle Art Museum from Rathbun as well, and I'm imagining some was kept in his family in addition. But in this photo from the auction house, you can see the wide variety of objects that was in his collections, from ceramic pieces to the Japanese print to even posters from museum exhibitions as well. So Rathbun had traveled wildly in East Asia and Japan and had acquired multiple different objects, many, many more than just multiple, as evident from the size of the estate sale. And additionally, since he was working as a curator, he was able to have up close and personal interactions with many objects as well. This makes him very qualified to do an explanatory discussion of Japanese art, and that is exactly what this essay is about. This essay isn't really arguing anything. Its main purpose is to be explanatory, and Rathbun discusses the history, context, and development of Japanese porcelain blue and white ware in the 17th century, and he discusses the multiple different forms and techniques that developed over time and in different kilns in Japan. And the main purpose of this essay was to actually explain the context around recently acquired Seiki Imari wares from the Seattle Art Museum by using this discussion of other 17th century Japanese porcelain that was in the collection as well to explain the new pieces. And Rathbun goes about this by referencing both scholarship from Professor Mikami to primarily doing a formal analysis of the objects themselves. Since he was curator of the museum, he was able to do extensive formal analysis and handle the pieces, which makes this essay very credible since it's a discussion of objects that the author was able to handle and be the curator of. Additionally, Rathbun goes about this discussion of the development of the pieces chronologically, which helps build up over time this overall narrative of 17th century porcelain wares in Japan. Some main terminology that Rathbun discusses, one of which is Arita, which was the main kiln of the time and had a big monopoly on Japanese produced porcelain. The wares coming from this kiln were referred to as Arita ware or Hizen ware, and also primarily Imari ware, which was the nearby port that was used to ship a lot of these pieces. After the fall of the Ming Dynasty, there was a big interest of these Japanese Arita and Imari wares, so exporting them to other countries became very popular. So a lot of these wares are just referred to as different forms of Imari ware, since that is the port which they were shipped out of. Another main kiln from the area is Kutani, and then there's also Kokutani, which references the older wares from that kiln. One of the types of Imari wares that Rathbun discusses in his article is Shoki, which is the earlier period, and it has grown in connoisseurship and really favored by connoisseurs because it has this more rugged form that is very appealing to collectors of folk art. And then the later form of Imari is the Seiki Imari ware, which were the ones recently acquired by the Seattle Art Museum that prompted the publication of this essay in 1994. And the Seiki Imari wares were less dependent on Chinese and Korean prototypes than the Shoki Imari wares, and they were also more refined in their manufacture and appearance than the preceding Shoki wares that tended to be more robust and rugged in their form. Another term that Rathbun discusses is tenchi, which refers to late Ming Dynasty export wares, and these also had an influence on 17th century Japanese produced porcelain as well. So one of the first wares that Rathbun discussed is the Shoki Imari wares. So they were very heavily Korean influenced, thickly potted wares with heavy glazes and sketchy designs done in a cobalt underglaze. Looking at the grapevine bolt plate on the left, you can see that it's in this very dark, rich cobalt, which implies that it was perhaps imported cobalt, though some of the other cobalt used for glazes at this time were domestic to the area around the kiln. Another important aspect of the Shoki Imari wares is that they were primarily small bowls and plates, and these bowls had thick rimmed foots that took up about 1/4 to 1/3 of the size of the overall form. Another really interesting point of the Shoki Imari wares and why they gain such a respect in folk art style is their very rugged, kind of imperfect forms. Oftentimes you would see fingerprints from where they were held by the potter on the wheel, or even marks from where they were held when they were dipped in glaze, where glaze is missing from held, and sometimes even the clay itself blistered, or there were cracks in the glazes. And these imperfections are one of the main notifying styles of the Shoki Imari ware that really makes them kind of stand out in this overall discussion of Japanese porcelain at this time. The other kind of ware is tenchi and Chinese traditionalist styles. While shoki was very influenced by Korean, that kind of developed over time, and then there's these porcelains that are seen to have this Ming China influence in them, and then have this early traditionalist style of very painterly designs. And also these types of ware in Japan tend to also be notable because they showed a development in shapes and forms, not just the shapes and forms of the designs that are done in these very painterly glazes, but also in the shapes of the vessels themselves. Now they're not only just small plates and bowls, you're seeing things such as this ewer design that is shown here. Next, we have the Katani ware, which is another kiln that created primarily blue and white ware and is notable for its deep blue glazes. There are two main types, the Ai Kutani ware, that's this indigo color, and Ao Kutani ware, which is more blue-green and is also notable for having green or purple and other vibrant colors painted on top. These wares were single fired and then pressed into a mold and then painted with the cobalt glaze. And while the earlier Japanese styles, such as Shoki Imari, had all these perfections, this style is really showing a development and leaning towards these more small, thin, very delicate forms and designs that were a lot more uniformly patterned and formed, and a lot more precise in their final product than the earlier Japanese wares. We also have the Kokutani wares, which again, the older style of Kutani wares that show a variance in glazes. This example on the slide shows an example of the Ameyu candy glaze, which is named after the Ame candy with its dark brown iron-rich glaze, and also shows a variance in shapes and forms. And again, these were created with press molds, and the molds had forms of the design, which allowed the design, in this case, these small little herons, to actually be embossed into the form of the plate. Finally, we have the Seiki Imari wares, and through this discussion of all these different Japanese porcelain styles, Rathbun really ends up showing the delicacy and intricacy of the Seiki wares when it leads up to this discussion. And you see these very thinly potted forms with the unblemished glaze and delicate paintings with minimal other decorations, and Rathbun describes them as balanced, which I think is very evident in the plain white background with the emphasis on this beautiful stark image of these glaze. And by putting it in context to these other wares, we really see how this style had developed over time throughout the 17th century, starting with the more rugged shoki imari wares, getting influence from Korea and China and other styles, and ultimately ending up on this very refined style. Ultimately, I found this essay to be very convincing and explained the different styles and development very thoroughly in a way that was easy to follow. My main critique, however, that was that Rathbun primarily just discussed plates. He does show the one ewer, and that is the one image in the essay that isn't a plate. And while primarily the vessels created at this time in 17th century Japan were mostly plates and bowls, uh, there were still other objects that were not plates and bowls. And even searching in the museum's collection online, I saw examples of vases from the Imari ports attributed to that area that were of other forms than plates that are in the collection now. Perhaps Rathbun didn't have access to them in the collection at the time that he was creating this essay, but it was still been interesting to provide more of a contrast and a discussion of the different forms to really highlight the beautiful, delicately created forms of the Seiki Imari wares that were in the collection at the time. And here's my bibliography. I cite Rathbun's essay, as well as all the images being from the Seattle Art Museum. Thank you so much for watching.